Today's webinar is a panel on emerging from crisis, what associations need to consider in order to thrive in the future. Our moderator is our very own Sherry Budziak, founder and CEO of .org Source, and my co-founder and co-author. Well, welcome, Sherry.
Thank you, Kevin. So thanks so much to Sharon, Jeff, and Stephanie for being a part of this conversation today. I was really excited to just hear from the three of you, and we had over 200 folks sign up to listen in on this discussion. So I'm really excited. Just before we get started, I wanted to let you guys introduce yourselves real quick. Jeff, we'll start with you. If you can just give us a little bit of background about you and what you do.
Well, thanks, Sherry. Appreciate the invitation to join. I'm Jeff Decagna, Executive Advisor for Foresight First LLC. I'm in Reston, Virginia, and I work with association boards and senior teams, primarily really on trying to build the capacity of boards through the practice of foresight, as well as in other ways, but really focusing a lot on building board capacity and connecting that to their need to understand, anticipate, and prepare for the future.
Great, thanks, Jeff. Stephanie? Oh, you're on mute.
First one of today. I'm Stephanie Reeves. I'm Executive Director of the Maryland Psychological Association. MPA is based in Columbia, Maryland. I've been an association executive for over 20 years. Got my start in government relations and have been with MPA for almost 5 years now. MPA represents psychologists who are licensed primarily in Maryland, but also work in the surrounding regions as well. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Sharon, we'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sharon Rice. I'm the Managing Director of Business Strategy for .org Source. And our strategy consulting practice includes a lot of specific strategy development, strategic planning. Right now, we're doing scenario planning a lot with our clients and our customers, and just helping organizations make their way through and anticipate what's yet to come during the COVID crisis.
Great, thank you. So just to get us started, wanted to kind of hear from you guys on how you think associations can provide value to their members in the short term to keep them engaged long term. So Stephanie, we'll start with you and hear what your thoughts are.
Sure. The important thing I think right now for associations to consider is communicate. What we're finding from our members is they have been thrown into a situation not of their own choice or their own doing, and they just need direction and guidance. And that's what we've been able to provide at MPA in this particular period of time. One of the other things we've realized is that, with a lot of associations, we offer our members a number of different benefits. And it's quite possible that all of your members are not aware of all the benefits. And so as we were approaching this period of time, this gave us a great opportunity to pull all of the resources we already had at our disposal together into a COVID page, which I believe every organization has now. But we were able to highlight, for example, the fact that we have a toolkit for psychologists who are currently in private practice, and that toolkit had already included information on how to transition to telehealth, which is what a lot of our members are doing right now. And it has, and along with that, we also did a webinar overall on psychological practice during this time, and we've also set up a series of different webinars based on the feedback from those who have already started the telehealth piece. So what we have found is that it has provided some really great content for us to highlight the work of our organization, of our members, highlighting a lot of those resources that we already had at our disposal. And because of that, we actually have been getting new members. And in fact, we had one member who rejoined the organization after a number of years and said to me, and I quote, "I'm rejoining the organization because you were putting out such great content and I felt guilty about not paying for it. I think that, you know, that's music to any CEO's ears. So I would say, you know, it's really important for associations to realize what it is that you already have at your disposal, because you already have the tools there to help your members. What they're trying to find more often than not is, where can I get those pieces of information in one area, in one facet, so that it can be the go-to. And that's what we've been able to create for our members, that one go-to piece where everyone can go and find information on everything from license renewal changes to what's happening with Medicare payments to how can I help other colleagues at this time. And so we've become that one-stop shop for our members. And in the short term, being able to provide all that information is great. But what we are establishing now in the long term is MPA is your go-to resource for information if you're a psychologist or a member of the general public looking for information on psychology.
And Stephanie, that's a great point. I actually, when this all started, I started seeing great things associations were doing and communicating, and just the value of the professional organizations. I actually recently, we started capturing all of that information, and I'm actually going to publish a document on our website ourselves in the next week, because there's just some great things going on. And I think that that's out of this, the positive with associations, that, you know, all the great work that they're doing is really getting highlighted. So that's fantastic. So that's always great to hear. Really great time to kind of to show value, as you said. So Jeff, what are your thoughts on how associations can provide value in the short term while, you know, keeping members engaged long term?
Well, you know, I tend to look at these issues through a different kind of lens, and so I want to offer a slightly different perspective, which I think that, you know, our current conditions that we're facing right now and that will emerge over the course of the next fiscal quarter and the rest of this calendar year really, I think, demand that we question our orthodox beliefs and begin to pursue alternative approaches. And so the question that I would, you know, offer to the participants today is, you know, who are the new stakeholders with whom your associations can build relationships that would be beneficial to everyone? There's going to be an opportunity here to really make new connections. And so I would suggest working on ways to build those relationships with those stakeholders who are not currently part of your association without regard to issues of membership, just simply through listening and learning, being empathic and being supportive, hearing what's going on with them, trying to invite them in, and lowering the traditional barriers that we have put up since COVID-19 doesn't respect those barriers anyway, to really connect the network up even more fully, strengthen that network that you've built with some of your core stakeholders. This is a time for us to be inclusive and not tribal. It's a time for us to unleash the power of serendipity. We never know what's going to emerge as we build those relationships with stakeholders who are not currently and have not previously been part of the organization. I think that by listening and learning and being empathic, we can discover new ways of creating value that we may never previously considered. And then it's a chance to invite all of those stakeholders into the process of value creation in a co-creative way that I think will not only have short-term benefits, but really enable the organization to achieve larger purposes over the long term.
Yeah, those are excellent points, Jeff. One of the other things that I've seen kind of immediately was even a lot of new partnerships within associations and different professions to address some of the issues that their, you know, specific professions were dealing with, from, you know, the medical societies working together and things like that. So excellent points and some good considerations. So Sharon, what do you have to add to kind of this thought and conversation?
Well, I think I'd like to bridge kind of both Stephanie and Jeff's comments, because I think that they are related. I agree that now is the time to be incredibly empathetic with our members and our customers. And there's only one way to do that, and that's really, as Stephanie was saying, communicating, but communicating in two-way street, really listening to what they're going through, making contact with them. So when we think about engagement, now is not, I think for most associations, there are some associations that are lucky and able to maintain revenue sources or potentially even gin up new revenue sources, although we're not hearing about a whole lot of those. But now is really the time to focus more on what your member is experiencing as opposed to trying to quickly make up revenue gaps. I know there was a question in the registration questions where somebody was talking about how do we preserve our reserves. Well, what we need to remember is now is the time to use those investment funds. This is the situation that they're there for. So taking a breather, not making knee-jerk, kind of responses, but just really connecting with and listening to members and customers, I think is the most important thing you can do to set yourself up to be able to respond to their needs and to survive this time. And I remember when in 2007 and 8, when we were starting to go through the recession, I was with APIX, which is ASEM now, and a supply chain organization, manufacturing-based organization. We were hit hard in 2008. And we just started across staff calling members and listening to members, not just leaders, but just random members. Our call center was calling, and not to try to sell anything, but rather to say, how are you doing? What can we do for you? Tell us how we can help. And I think that goes a tremendously long way in these early days, and we're still in early days, to strengthening that connection, to the member. And, Stephanie, as you were saying, I think that also makes them want to be a member as well, that kind of caring. If they can afford to pay their dues, if they can afford to continue to support the association, they're much more likely to do that when we can kind of reach out to them in any kind of personal way.
Great, thanks, Sharon. We're getting a few questions in the chat. Feel free to continue putting your questions in, and we will get to those questions as we move along here. So I'm going to start with Jeff this time. So Jeff, we kind of saw this activity as there's all these short-term needs, right? We talk about, Stephanie is executive director of MPA, having to pivot to communicate differently or even more with her members, et cetera. So there's a lot of, switching meetings to virtual, all this activity that went on. So there's a lot of short-term needs, but how do you balance that with the long-term or sustainability of the organization? Because what I think about often is that, what are the gaps going to be, and how do we make sure these associations are sustainable when you've put all your eggs here right now in this kind of time of crisis? So would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so what I'm going to say is not going to probably be very reassuring or popular, but as a foresight practitioner, I feel responsible to say it. So I think that short-term pessimism is the only responsible mindset for association decision makers. As we look at the full landscape of what is unfolding, and we're only still closer to the beginning of what we're going through than we are to the end. And so the question that I would want everyone to ask is, what are our organization's greatest vulnerabilities? What are we most fearful of? And that's different from what keeps you up at night. This is, confronting the fears and vulnerabilities the organization has, the board has, and so on, and to understand them better and prepare accordingly. And I want to draw a distinction between contingency planning and scenarios, right? Because they're not the same thing. So in the short-term time horizon, which for me right now is really through the end of 2021, so essentially the next 20 months, what we want to, I think, be doing is thinking about, over that time horizon, what's the contingency planning that needs to be undertaken to mitigate the most detrimental consequences for the association and its stakeholders, minimizing the financial and human impact of what's going on. And contingency planning is about assuming the most adverse conditions going forward and then asking the hardest questions. So what if we do have to cancel our major meetings out of necessity because there are stay-at-home orders, or because there are mass gathering bans, and so on, or because of other factors like that? What if we have permission from localities to move forward, but what are the risks of people who don't want to travel, who don't want to put themselves in mass gatherings of any size at any, in the course of these next few years before we have a vaccine or before, there's other mitigating factors. What if revenues drop by 25, 50% or more? What steps are we going to take in each of those contingencies? And we've got to put everything on the table. Everything has to be on the table under these conditions. And I would tie those contingencies to some of the key organizational health metrics so that the board can monitor them, looking at those metrics around revenue and expense and cash flow and so on and so forth. What are the actions associated with specific red flags that might emerge in those metrics, and be transparent, with staff, with partners on what those metrics are, what those red flags are, and how decisions will get made. So that's sort of the short-term time horizon for contingency planning. For me, the longer-term time horizon is 24 to 60 months. And the scenarios really need to be focused on learning with the future and reinventing the association for the benefit both of those it currently serves and those who will come later. Because the thing we have to understand in the midst of a crisis is that the decisions we're making today will not only affect the people we know, they will affect people that we do not know who will arrive later in this decade. And so we've got to be mindful of their concerns. And so for me, the scenario approach, I prefer the idea of looking at a 60-month time horizon, because it will force us to confront the impact of other forces of turbulence that are going to shape this decade, like AI and automation, the climate crisis, economic inequality, data and privacy concerns, the rejection of expertise. These are already forces that are reshaping our environment. They were already going to reshape this decade, and actually the pandemic is accelerating and intensifying them even as we speak. And so we really need provocative and plausible scenarios that will challenge the orthodox beliefs of the board, enable decision-making that is focused on the future, that is focused on reinvention. And I just want to take a moment to thank Emily, because I emailed her last night and she said it would be okay for me to mention here that next week I'm going to be doing a webinar for Association Forum of Chicagoland on developing your association's COVID-19 scenarios of the future. It's next Wednesday, May the 6th at 2 p.m. Central Time. And if you're interested in finding out more about that, you can go to associationforum.org, or you can email me at foresightfirst@gmail.com. But I really think we've got to have those two different time horizons of the next 20 months and then really the longer term, and really pushing as far out as we can so that we can be thinking about short-term contingency planning and then longer-term reinvention of our organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So Stephanie, what are your thoughts to follow up on Jeff's comments?
Well, my sense is, a lot of the conversations and that Jeff pointed out are conversations I will be having, because he's correct in that, we need to we're going to have to take some really hard look at things going forward. I want to approach this from a slightly different perspective, and that's from an advocacy point, because something that, just seems to be kind of coming up now for us. What this period of time have introduced is a concept that had been kind of bubbling up in some of the states regarding psychological practice, particularly between different states. And what we are finding is that being thrown into the scenario now where those questions had to be asked, and you have 50 different perspectives on how the practice of psychology is between states are going, we now realize that in the long term, there's going to have to be some questions about what particular bills we're going to have to support to address this potentially going forward. And so from an advocacy standpoint, that's probably going to be one of the more interesting dynamics of all of this. I think associations will now see and understand some of the challenges, not only that their members are facing, but as associations we're facing. And it will be interesting to see kind of in that long term what the advocacy piece is going to look like. And those are conversations in addition to budget and finance and revenue and expenditures we're having, because what's currently happening with us in Maryland is going to eventually end up being some type of legislation in the next 18, 20 months from now for us. And as Jeff pointed out correctly, it's not going to just impact our members. This is going to impact all psychologists in the state. So from that short-term, long-term, obviously we are thinking about from the association standpoint of viability and surviving, but also I would encourage everyone to keep an eye on the advocacy piece going forward, because that's going to be an important part for us to address going forward in the short and in the long term.
Yeah, great. So Sharon, to kind of follow up on that, you had mentioned that you had gone through the economic crisis with Apex, and kind of want to hear some more of the kind of your thoughts and lessons learned, and kind of, as Stephanie said, how you survived through that the recession.
Yeah, that was an informative experience, obviously. And I would say a lot of the similarity is in feeling right now, and that sense of stress and sense of crisis, because that was a demand-driven recession. And it's different in a lot of ways than what we're looking at. And one of the hardest things that we're experiencing right now is that we don't really know what the next 12 months looks like. So it's hard to kind of just say, well, this is the future we're working towards, because we don't know if that's realistic or not realistic right now. So it feels like we've been, home forever. It feels like this is dragging on, and yet I'm pretty convinced that we're just looking at right now, we're just in that eye of the storm phase, and we're having a hard time kind of grappling with that. And I think one of the dangers when you're in that short term, when you're in the eye of the storm, is that you can have a tendency to have knee-jerk reactions or overreactions. And this is one of the things when we were, when I was at Apex, when I was responsible at the time for the front office revenue. So that was a difficult position, to be in when the revenue was falling, fast. And we didn't know what bottom was really going to look like. And there was a decision that we had made. The board had voted on a dues increase, and the CEO, Abe Ashkenazi, tells the story all the time. And it's really interesting, I think, in the way it worked out, because Apex hadn't had a dues increase in forever. And so in 2007, before we had any inkling of a recession, so, this was probably in the October timeframe, the board voted on a dues increase. And the members were mad, the chapters were mad. We were hearing a lot about it. And so when it came time to implement that dues increase, we already were aware that we were in a recession. We didn't know how it was going to completely affect or how bad it was going to be. It was about the March 2008 timeframe. And we had to make a decision about, do you go with the dues increase or do you hold back at this point? And for a variety of reasons, and we did it, kind of made a decision tree and looked at the pros and the cons and the probabilities around, people renewing or not renewing. And ultimately, Abe and the board made the decision based on the data we gathered to go ahead and do the dues increase. And it made a huge difference. So yes, there were some members who could not pay. And to those members, we did reach out and we offered some options. There were members who didn't want to pay, were mad because of the increase and didn't pay. But the truth of the matter is that what the increase did is it did carry us. So those members that could still afford to pay, kind of coming back, Stephanie, to what you were saying about the member who wanted to pay, felt guilty about not paying. For those members that could afford to pay, they contributed pretty significantly to the long-term viability then of the association. So I think when we're making decisions right now about, I've seen some things that we've talked to clients that are saying, well, should we offer free membership through this period? Should we reduce certification prices or other key kind of products and services? It's really important to do the financial analysis, think about the probabilities and how what we know right now is affecting your industry and profession, and make cautious decisions. Again, maintaining total empathy with your members, but not doing anything that potentially puts you in jeopardy. So get through this survival phase, and that's what we're in right now, is the survival phase, so that you have the luxury of being able to think about the future.
Great, thanks, Sharon. So I want to switch the discussion just a little bit on what associations should be doing with their boards. Should they be adjusting their 2020 strategic plans, and kind of why not? And I know we just have a few minutes left. This time flew by really quickly. I think we could stay on this webinar with you guys for another hour or so, but we won't. So Sharon, can you just kind of give your thoughts on that?
I probably wouldn't worry about your 2020 strategic plan right now. I think that there's a couple of reasons. One is that unless you anticipated a pandemic in your future, you maybe weren't well positioned in that plan. And to Jeff's point, in the way the world is going to change and how you're going to want to take advantage of those opportunities. So, you know, depending on what you call a strategic plan and what it includes, I think what's important right now is really dealing with what is in front of you. Cash is king. That means that, you know, we're not going to make a lot of investments in new products and services during this time. Typically, most associations would.
Jeff?
So I think it's important to understand that there's no going back to the pre-pandemic normal. There's no business as usual going forward. So the question really is what learning, you know, what new learning does the association need to do starting today? And I think not only do we need to sort of shelve, you know, strategic plans, we need to shelve strategic planning. We should have let go of strategic planning a long time ago. It's outlived its usefulness in this environment. This was always going to be a turbulent decade, even before the pandemic. The pandemic is making it more turbulent. My concern really is that if associations are not able to adapt and reinvent themselves, even under these conditions, that the rest of this decade is going to be even more difficult for us. So I think what we need to be doing is really saying, you know, how can we adapt to this turbulence and begin the process of reinvention? And really the two ways of approaching it are really to look at strategy from this point forward. Again, we should have been doing this sooner, but from this point forward, we'll look at strategy as a process of learning with the stakeholders that we have and the stakeholders that we can invite into our organizations, and then really building the practice of foresight so we can be learning more with the future as it unfolds, and again, on behalf of our successors. So we really need to be concentrating on what we can learn now as much as possible, both in the short term and the long term, so we can be more adaptive and better prepared for how things unfold, not just the rest of this year, but for every year after this and the rest of this decade. I
absolutely agree with you, Jeff. That's great comments. Thanks. So Stephanie, you have anything to add to that?
I would just say pretty quickly, in terms of your board, I agree with Sharon and Jeff that, you know, it's not going to be business as usual going forward. And for a board, that's a scary proposition. There's a lot of people who have a vested interest in your organization that cling to what has worked. And they do not like, there's a lot of board members that are not comfortable with change. And so the conversations now from a CEO, executive director perspective to your board is, we are in a very uncertain time. We are going to be in an uncertain time for the foreseeable future. We're going to have to change the way some things are done. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be comfortable, and it's not always going to be safe, but we can't continue the way we have been going if we want to survive and also thrive. And so those are going to be the hard conversations that we're going to have probably continuously over and over again with our boards, because again, this is all uncomfortable for everyone. And having to tell them that some of the things that have worked probably won't continue to work, and we're going to have to take some risk here, are conversations that a lot of boards are not comfortable with, they have not had experience with, and now are being thrust into, again, this unknown, and then have to now go ahead and pivot yet again. And we'll have to probably continue to pivot going forward. And so, you know, to my colleagues, you know, this is not going to be easy road for any of us, but I think, you know, the great thing about this community is that we're all in this together, and we can all learn and grow from all of this from each other. So
absolutely. That's thank you, Stephanie. So we had and we're at 3 o'clock, but we did have a couple questions that I just wanted to take real quick for those of you that want to stay on. So somebody asked if we're seeing furloughs with associations. I know that I can answer that. We did see one group have to do some layoffs. It was because they were a certifying board, and they only had the ability to take their tests on site at a physical location, and it didn't have an option to do that anywhere else. So that was where all their revenue was. So that was a challenge for them. There's been some talks when executives are going through scenario planning, but I personally haven't seen a lot. Jeff, have you seen a lot of Stafford? You're on mute.
I'm not aware of any at the moment.
Yeah. So, which is good news. I think the organizations that are struggling are those that were struggling prior to this, and so it's just accelerating those issues, I think, a bit. So, any other questions? Any other last thoughts from anyone? Stephanie, Sharon, Jeff, before we end for today?
I just want to thank you all for having this really important conversation, and because again, I think we are really all in uncharted territory, and we're all trying to figure our way through it in some form or fashion. And it's important for us to continue having these lines of communications open among groups and sharing it with colleagues. So thank you very much for having this forum for us to talk about these issues.
Yeah, thank you.
And I would just say also that, as everybody is saying, if you're watching any TV at all, this is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so pacing ourselves is going to be really important. We've got a ways to go.
Yeah, and I would just, in closing, I would just say, as much as I agree that we're still, since we're in the early stages of this and organizations are still to some extent triaging, and there are some choices that are being made right now, we cannot allow ourselves to get stuck in just doing that, right? There has got to be a choice to devote attention to where this goes from here, because one of the things I do is I try to look at a lot of different information, and there's a lot of discussion about the so-called, post-COVID-19, post-novel coronavirus. I don't know when the post is. Right. And so there's no waiting for the post to have those conversations. This is going to be going on for a while. The ripple effects and attendant consequences will be significant for a long period of time. So now's the time to begin not only the preparations for what's happening now, or the decisions for dealing with the immediate concerns, but that longer term reinvention process, which is going to be absolutely necessary. Because if we wait another 12 months, another 24 months, then it becomes even more difficult to do it. So now's the time, while there is a chance to really have that thought process. They must go hand in hand.
Well, on those comments, I think we can end. Excellent, Jeff. Appreciate all of your guys' experience, expertise, the knowledge you shared with the community today was great. And I think, Stephanie, as you said, it's an important conversation, which we wanted to bring you guys together. Appreciate it. And you guys all take care and stay safe. Everybody stay healthy, and we will talk soon.